Hello, everybody. Hi, welcome back. Here we are in our 10th class, incredibly. The last class was on a five-element differentiation of shadow. And this class is on therapeutic principles and how to treat shadow using acupuncture, herbs, and Chinese medicine. Now, how to treat shadow has actually been implicit in everything I've been teaching up to now. And really, what I'm teaching here is the result of me contemplating the results of just what I do. So, to be clear, mostly the way I treat shadow is through a depth approach to Chinese medicine. And a depth approach to Chinese medicine, one based on tongue, pulse, hara, eye diagnosis, color, sound, odor, and emotion, listening to all the subtle signs, cues, symptoms, essentially listening deeply, deeply, and paying attention, very, very deep attention to the patient, having a clear intention about why we're doing what we're doing and noticing the results and waking up to all the dimensions of the self within our own self in the way I've advocated for in this class, so that we have a non-abstract relationship to all the different parts of the self, the soul, the conscience, emptiness, luminosity, the superego, the unconscious, the subconscious, the pre-conscious, the authentic self, and understanding how all those dimensions feel and where they come from, what their motivations are, what the results of identifying with them and enacting their various values are in the world, and forging a relationship to the deeper and more noble parts of ourselves, shifting identification to the deepest and to the highest, and giving ourselves to the utter positivity of the life impulse in a selfless and a creative way with confidence, and noting the effect in the world when we act from these higher and deeper values. This is all the basis of the medicine and what it means to be the medicine, rather than to just be a practitioner who has a knowledge base and techniques to do something to others as a technical skill, and to treat signs, to treat symptoms, rather to engender a wholeness in the self, in the patient self, and a wholeness with self, capital S, in a way that the patient's transformation is separate in no way, shape, or form from creation itself, or from the evolution of creation itself. So the two become one thing as we move from being egos in the world to becoming souls. We're no longer primarily motivated by the ego's fears and desires and its I, me, mine motive. And the self that we are acting for and out of is now a self that is larger than the personal sphere. And we begin looking through the eyes of deep time and the eyes through many lives. And this instills a broad view, a deep compassion and a deep compassion and a deep passion to change things. And that passion to change and be the catalyst for change is balanced by an agape, the love of the higher for the lower, an agapic embrace of things just exactly as they are. And we develop a deep compassion that's born of passion, but also of a profound patience, understanding, and interest. So when I talk about the therapeutic principles here, the real headline is just to learn and practice Chinese medicine in its gross, subtle, very subtle, and very, very, very subtle depths and breadth. And what I've done in the pursuit of that depth and the pursuit of the kind of understanding and embodiment that I'm talking about over the last 40 years. I got into Chinese medicine in 1980 and started practicing in 85. So at the turn of this new year, I'll been practicing 40 years and actually really have given my life to the medicine for 45. And in the pursuit of this lifelong pursuit of this depth, I'm really just elaborating here what I've seen of a subtle and very subtle nature in terms of just practicing straight Chinese medicine. So the practice of shadow resolution in Chinese medicine is relatively less about learning specific techniques to resolve shadow and very much more about understanding how all the things we already do in Chinese medicine are indicated, implicated, called for, act upon, benefit, and produce results in the subtle and very subtle dimensions of the self. So having said that, let's just consider treatment from the standpoint of shadow resolution. So in terms of therapeutic approaches, basically, Chinese medicine is the science of integrity. It's the science of the integrity of yin and yang. And all we can diagnose, no matter how we talk about it or think about it, is we diagnose separation, how yin and yang are coming apart, and separation is pain. And the entire goal of the medicine is union. And in promoting communication between yin and yang, in promoting union, the union of yin and yang, that is the union of heaven and earth, and it's the union of heaven, human, and earth. And it is essentially non-dual realization of waking up, growing up, cleaning up, showing up, and opening up of the human being. So in the service of promoting communication between yin and yang, we have two things at our disposal. I like breaking things down to basically the basis because there is so much that we can elaborate and so much nuance and so much theory we can elaborate, but it's important never to lose the plot because, never to lose the plot or get lost in the plot and forget what the theme is, the thread of meaning through it all. So in the pursuit of union, we have two avenues open to us. The first is to tonify the upright influences, supporting Jing, primordial yin and yang, supporting qi and supporting shen. And the Jing, Qi, and Shen, the three treasures, are the fundamental basis that is heaven, human, and earth, moon, star, sun, Jing, Qi, and Shen. It's the Jing, Qi, and Shen that constitute the force of pushing toward union through apparent separation, and fundamentally through union engendering evolution of the self, creative evolution of the self, movement of the soul to increase states of transparency and potency, and generating the clear white light of consciousness that recognizes itself in everything and everyone, in the recognition of no separation, because that separation can be caused certainly by obstructions in the body, but it's most significantly caused by having our attention on the wrong thing and identifying with and believing in what is false, wrong, and untrue. So we can support the upright influences of Jing, Qi, and Shen, and everybody here knows how to do that. And anything you do to tonify and support the upright influences of Jing, Qi, and Shen empowers a force from within that is creative and evolutionary and endeavors to unrepress the repressed, put everything on the table, face everything for what it is, put the stake in the ground, renounce victimization, see everything for what it is, put the stake on the ground, and go straight ahead and move ahead. So the upright influences are the support evolution. Jing, Qi, and Shen, well, there are 3 Hun. And those 3 Hun can be thought of as psychic emanations of Jing, which is kidney, Qi, which is liver, and Shen, which is heart. And that's the move, creative evolution up the left half of the Sheng cycle. So we can support the upright influences, and then we can eliminate everything that is false, wrong, and untrue. And we speak of these things as pathogens. And there are 7 stars in the Big Dipper, 7 sources of light in heaven. The Big Dipper being the central administration of human destiny, 7 holes in the head to receive that light, and 7 internal and 7 external pathogens to obscure that light. And we can talk about pathogens as wind, cold, damp, heat, and we went through them in the 5-element class. And I gave you this analogy of the 7 stars in the Big Dipper, 7 portals, 7 sources of light, 7 portals of light, and 7 pathogens to obstruct light. I talked about that early in the class. And yes, I'm repeating myself, but hopefully by now, maybe you'd be hearing this in a deeper and in a different way, less of a maybe introductory way or the first time I heard it sort of way, and maybe more now with some more 4-dimensional knowing, rather than just learning it as a fact, actually experiencing the luminosity of the realization. So we can support the upright and eliminate the false, wrong, and the untrue. Now we can talk about the false, we can objectify and somatize the false, wrong, and the untrue as pathogens, something in here and something out there that does something to us. But it pays and is important to understand the role we play in creating the vulnerability to external pathogens and amplifying and inflating internal pathogens through our attention. And our attention is invested into these things which are unwholesome as a matter of pride, as a matter of pretense, in order for the ego to maintain the illusion of separation. So when it comes to eliminating the false, wrong, and untrue, we have all kinds of treatments for it. So draining aggressive energy lifts the veil of cynicism and sarcasm, agitation, doubt, bitterness, resentment, jealousy, poison. And you can read about that in clinical practice on page 16. I'm not going to go all through these treatments. Many of you have taken other courses with me and you've learned them. Many of you have gone to 5-element schools, even if you haven't studied with me before and you know them. And for people who don't know them, you just read in the red book, the chapter. And I'm happy to take any questions on them. You know, in the class group at nourishingdestiny.com, or in our discussion for this class. So draining aggressive energy is superficial needling of the Bacchian shoe points, and it eliminates a whole layer of cynicism, sarcasm, bitterness, doubt, all these toxic, sort of poisonous, festering emotional states that come from just unwholesome relationship. Aggressive energy can come from the exterior in terms of environmental pathogens or other people's negativity. So it can be introjected into us, but once it comes into us and it can also arise from unwholesome investment in emotions and our own emotional states. So it can arise from within and be projected outwards onto others as negativity. And it could come from outside, from toxic food, chemicals in the environment, or other people's toxicity, and be introjected into us. And then we can identify with it and inflate its presence with our attention within ourselves and grow it within ourselves until it festers within, and we have insomnia and our nervous system's totally agitated, and we're bitter and resentful and poisoned and snappy and all of these kind of things. So in terms of eliminating what's false, wrong, and untrue, there's possession. And, there's a whole chapter on possession. The hallmark of possession is lack of eye contact. The person's eyes are like black holes that no light escapes from. And there's no joy in the person, stuck in a monochromatic form of expression, and it's hard to make human contact with a person. So despite all of the great sort of psychological theory about working with shadow and all the coaching around shadow and all of these different books, if a person has aggressive energy, if a person's possessed, you can forget shadow resolution, because they don't possess themselves. One of the main things, really, I would say, the main thing from my point of view, in the small amount I know about internal family systems, is the mentioning in just a few sentences in that book about the relative importance of encouraging and rooting the patient in the self, capital S, so they can look at all the other dimensions of the self from the position of self, capital S. So they can look at the wounded parts and the firefighters and all the parts that are compensating. They can look at these parts from the self. And you can't do that if you're possessed. And clearing aggressive energy and clearing possession are absolutely essential, so that essentially we want the emperor sitting on the throne wearing red and doing all this work from there. We're doing all the shadow work and looking at everything that has to look at and bearing everything that has to be born from being in the right place at the right time for the right reasons, which means the heart and the self, capital S, Shen, capital S, are on the throne and holding all of this, some of which is very, you may have discovered, if you're engaging sincerely with this class, very challenging and uncomfortable. But when the emperor is sitting on the throne, it can be held in with deep insight, the deepest insight of witness consciousness, and the deepest compassion of witness consciousness, which holds it all in a deep time perspective. So treating aggressive energy, clearing possession, and we can ask ourselves, what is the motivation of the behavior? And what is the motivation of the behavior? Where is the shadow coming from? Again, when we talk about shadow resolution, every stage has its shadow. That's absolutely true. So a person can be at 7th chakra still just pathologically holding on to witness consciousness because of the bliss and the ecstasy of it and the sense of being beyond it all. And a lot of gurus have gotten in trouble because they were addicted to that. And because they believed they were beyond it all, and karma free, they created all kinds of terrible karma. Now, it is true that every stage has its substitute gratifications for the seventh chakra, bliss and non-attachment, and its addictions that keep it from taking the next step and stopping that stage from healthfully consolidating. But for the most part, we're not going to have to worry in our practice about treating too many people whose essential problem in life is that they're obstructed at the seventh chakra. When we're talking about shadow resolution for the broad, even if you live in Boulder or Marin, even if you're practicing in Boulder or Marin or Santa Fe, or Berkeley, for the most part, the shadow resolution is the first three chakras. And the first chakra is reflexive and survival. The second chakra is sexual and instinctive. And the third chakra is power dynamics and impulsive. And so when we talk about the shadow that is obstructing the healthy consolidation of later stages, for most of us, we're talking about unresolved shadows stored in the first three chakras, and those first three chakras are under the diaphragm, and they are the lower base motives of the human being. These are the motives that Donald Trump has an innate genius for unrepressing in people, so that anyone he's in contact with feels emboldened to be their very worst self. Their very worst self. And again, it's not a political statement. It's just simply so. It's obvious to see the effects that he has on everything and everyone around him and everything he touches. So hopefully by the time you're watching this video, we'll be done with him. And from my perspective, Kamala and Tim will have been in the White House for a little while. And but you know, if it's not one thing, it's another. So I'm sure as you listen to this, something's going on. So anyway, something is happening, to quote a very wise person I have studied with. Something is happening. So what's the motivation of the behavior? Usually the first three chakras. The fourth chakra, which can be accessed through CV14, CV15 area, actually, but is the heart chakra. So CV14 and 15 are just below the diaphragm and kind of on the diaphragm in that diaphragmatic area. And with the fourth chakra, you know, that's halfway to the seventh chakra, right? 3 above and 3 below. And from there, that's the ground of what we would consider true and authentic awakening. So, you know, Jesus and Buddha were some of the first people in history to actually become individuals. And they were fully awakened at the fourth chakra. And at the fourth chakra, they weren't Buddhists. Lao Tzu wasn't a Taoist, and Jesus wasn't a Christian. They became individuals who were able to get downloads from the seventh chakra, and then their downloads were translated into the cultures of their time in languages that the average person could understand and take literally, rather than metaphorically. So the fourth chakra is belonging. So we have reflex, survival, instinct, sexual, impulse and power. For the third chakra, the fourth chakra is belonging. It's mythic membership. And this is where most of the shadow is we're resolving. So for instance, if you're aware in culture and you live in a place where many of the people who come to you are postmodern, it pays to be aware that a lot of people at a postmodern stage of development have an awful lot of pre-modern mythic membership and impulsive and instinctual and survival shadow. So the hallmark, for instance, of mythic membership, which is belonging above and beyond anything else, the greatest identification is belonging to the collective, and the worst punishment is being excommunicated, floated out on an iceberg, and being punished in that way. Separation, which is the function of the lung and colon, to separate the clean from the unclean. So the sorry, there was a technical glitch there. So the imperative of mythic membership is you're in, you're out, you're with us or you're against us. Now, it should be apparent that in postmodernism, the whole cancel movement and people rioting in Berkeley and setting cars on fire because someone they don't agree with is speaking at a college campus, that near complete and utter intolerance for other perspectives and the emphasis on needing to speak just so and never use certain words and always use certain words, and you have to speak like this and you have to speak like that, or you're losing your job. It all in the name of social justice, which is the purvey of postmodernism, the capacity, pluralism, the capacity to hold many perspectives, gave rise to Walk a Mile in My Shoes. It gave rise to the social justice movement, the civil rights movement. And the upside is fighting for the dignity of all human beings to live a life free from fear, regardless of skin color or country of background or economic class or gender identification. And that is a noble and a beautiful thing to uphold. But it's taken to such an extreme that no other perspectives, no other language can be tolerated. And what you're seeing here is a huge amount of unresolved and repressed membership shadow being manifest in postmodernism as you're in, you're out, you're with us, or you're against us. And most notably, the most stunning example of this were liberals calling Al Franken to resign because when he was a comedian in a comedy troupe, he had made a joke about grabbing a woman's breasts while they were sleeping on a plane with 12 other people present, all fooling around. And there were other photographs of her doing the exact same thing to him when they were all posing together. And and that shows the height of that insanity. Well, that's membership shadow. That comes from a repression of the patriarchy of mythic membership culture, and a throwing out of the baby with the bathwater, and a repression of that form so it shows up a shadow, and counseling a good man like Al Franken, who completely, and Al Franken was so good, as soon as people said, hey, we're not happy that you did that, he said, okay, I'll resign. Fair's fair. When anyone at a higher or lower stage of development would have said, get a life. Right? So we're talking very significantly about shadow from these first three stages, and also shadow from the fourth stage can make its way known. Shadow from the fifth stage, which is rationality, shows up in later stages as stagnant materialism. Just materialism. The rationality is, I think, therefore I am. Everything in the world can be measured. If it can't be measured, it's not real. Only that which is material is real. And that material, what are the two things destroying the world now? As bad as the distortions are in postmodernism, particularly postmodern academia, where no other points of view are tolerated, that's not what's destroying the world. What's destroying the world is tribal warfare, and that's the third chakra, right? Just impulsive, ethnocentric tribal warfare. And people at a mythic membership stage who are killing each other over their creation myths. And so that's the first two things destroying the world. And the third is materialism, which is the distortion of rationalism. As tedious as postmodern flatland egalitarianism can be, it isn't really destroying the world. It re-enchants the world, and it's really the stepping stone into a second tier of consciousness where you can have a top-down view of all of these dynamics. Anyway, this was a lot. I've probably said it all before in this course, and I know I have in other courses. If you want to know about all the stages of the development of consciousness in humanity from the archaic stages up through the transcendent subtle stages, you read my green book. That's what it's about in the context of Chinese medicine. So what is the motivation of the behavior? Which chakra does it come from? What age is the self-structure they are coming from? Where do they feel it in the body, and where is it in the body? So for instance, oral fixations, well, the mouth is up here, but oral fixations are from the first chakra. And it's right, because the mouth of the infant is put to the mother's nipple. And thumb sucking and suckling is the substitute gratification for union for the first chakra. So a person has an oral fixation coming from issues of having overly bonded or not bonded with the mother, in the first few months of life, in the first year or two of life. But that damp, because it tends to descend, can accumulate anywhere, and it can even ascend to the head, right? One can have dampness in the head, but it can descend to the lower chakra. So a person with an oral fixation may have dampened the lower chakra, manifesting as fibroids collecting and obstructing the lower chow. So we can treat with Guizhou Fuling Wan the qi in the blood and damp stagnation in the lower chow, but we also want to work around the belly button and work around the mouth to address the oral reflex. So the belly button, CV8, burning moxon there, 20, 30 moxa, several treatments in a row, helps to reestablish the umbilical connection of the individual to the universe itself and to creation itself, and create agency and autonomy so that the person can become their own mother and is no longer a victim of that relationship early in life. So then we need to, and then working around the mouth can address the oral reflex. And then we need to contextualize, help the person frame, and reframe, be able to look at their history in a top-down way from the leading edge of their own development, which is already free and has already overcome the problem. So we want to promote communication, and that means open up the diaphragm. That all the 12 main meridians go through the diaphragm, and I've written whole chapters on that. I think if you read the Wood chapter in Deepening Perspectives, there's a lot in there on the diaphragm, and also some in clinical practice. If you read on Bansha Hoputang and Bansha Sheshintang, all 12 channels go through the diaphragm, right? So foot tai yin, arm tai yin, leg xiaoyang, arm xiaoyang. They all go through the diaphragm, all the 12 channels. So when the diaphragm is constricted in an act of repression, it's choking, creating separation above and below. And separation above and below is a physiological metaphor for lack of communication between consciousness and the unconscious. And in terms of yin and yang and integrating them, one of the most significant ways we can understand and talk about the integration of yin and yang in the subtle dimensions of the self is the free and easy and joyful creative collaboration between consciousness and the unconscious. So that a person is no longer at war with their unconscious, afraid of the monster under their bed, and instead is walking through life with an open heart, with a radiance that's coming continually out of the infinite darkness of the depth of emptiness, out of the self, a flourishing radiance through the heart, which is intuitively informing us of our life curriculum in the context of the soul's journey through many, 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 many lives. And many, 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 many lives is just a metaphor for having played all the roles of victim, victimizer, abused and abuser, abandoned and abandoner. We've done it all, and not just in some possibly fictitious past life, but we've done it all in this life. And seeing that we've played all the roles and are playing all the roles engenders a kind of interest and compassion and openness that shifts the emphasis from being a victim of circumstances to realizing that this self we are working with, deconstructing and reconstructing, is working not just with the personal issues of mommy did this and daddy did that and my uncle did this and my brother did that and my sister did this and my wife and my husband and blah, my teacher. And we're not, as we evolve, we're less and less working with personal issues, and we're working more and more and more with forces of infinite proportion and cosmic dimension. And that the work we're doing, even though it might have started out as personal, is increasingly less personal and increasingly transpersonal, which means that we can't do it ourselves. We have to do it together and with each other, creatively together. So promoting communication, we open the diaphragm, and then other paradigms of creating communication are entry-exit points, create communication, promoting the flow of qi around the Chinese clock by using entry-exit points, balancing akabanis so that the left and right halves of each channel are in free and easy communication with each other. All of these are in service of shadow resolution. So if you thought I was going to teach you all these magical, like, you know, do kidney 23 and it resolves this kind of shadow, that's just not how it works. Chinese medicine is already doing shadow resolution. It's just the Chinese had next to no understanding of shadow relative to the context that has evolved in the West since the 1800s. And I might get canceled for suggesting that white men and women actually were able to come up with some creative insights into the human condition that furthered humanity, held the potential to actually understand humanity's condition. So most people wouldn't have a problem with the idea that white people could study East Asian medicine, learn it, and benefit. So shouldn't really be too much of a problem. Probably someone's wiggling in their seat while I'm saying those things, but But if you are, that's postmodern shadow, and it's good to look into. So the headline for the first part of this lecture really is that everything we do in Chinese medicine already affects communication between yin and yang, promotes upright influences and eliminates obstruction. And shadow is just obstruction. And the upright influences are light. And so to the degree that any of us are practicing an authentic depth tradition of Chinese medicine and have contemplated the depth and the subtle and very subtle nuances of the techniques and theories we've learned in a way that gives us deep and profound insight into ourselves and the human condition, and generally for the sake of treating others, is that this course serves to give signifiers for extending the view of what's already being done into the subtle and very subtle realms, so we understand what we're already doing in Chinese medicine as shadow resolution. Having said that, let's look at some principles of point selections. So we can choose points on Ren, conception vessel, Du, governor vessel, and Changmai, the Chang vessel. So the order of emergence is Ren is the infinite ocean. There are two ways to look at this, and it can be a little confusing. So Chang can be 0, or it can be 3. Changmai is the undifferentiated interpenetration of yin and yang. So the Changqi is the whirling vertex between heaven and earth, and the function of qi is to hold heaven and earth apart, and at the same time, hold them together so they're just one thing. So the Changqi can be looked at as all dualities, heaven, earth, up, down, left, right, should, shouldn't, good, bad, inside, outside, Ren and Du, so interpenetrated that there are no distinctions. And no distinctions means beyond the mind. And so that can be emptiness. And out of emptiness come duality, which is Ren and Du. And Ren is the infinite ocean, and Du as governor vessel, as the sea of Yang, as the vessel of Yang, is the North Star that rises out of the ocean. So we can look at Chang as 0, Ren as 1, and Du as 2. Yeah, hi, sorry again for the glitch. So we can choose points on Ren. Oh, so I was saying that Chang can be 1, 0, Chang can be 0. And then that emptiness in which all dualities are implicit within each other, so no distinction can be made. And then Ren can be the infinite ocean of yin, and Du the North Star rising out of it. But another way to think about it is that Ren is the infinite ocean, Du is the North Star, Ren is earth, Du is heaven, and the Changmai manifests as the Changqi as number 3, which is liver 3, Tai Chang. As the liver is positioned between water and fire, between yin and yang, to regulate qi. And so the Changqi is that qi between heaven and earth that blends the distinctions of heaven and earth back into one. And you know, that is relevant in, for instance, the diaphragm being halfway between the top and the bottom, right? As the internalization of wall, with everything above being heaven, moon, star, sun, the moon being the lungs, the sun being the heart, and the stars being the 7 holes in the head, the Big Dipper, and everything under the diaphragm being the unconscious. So above we have consciousness, under we have the unconscious, and the function of the diaphragm is to have free and easy movement through breath, through flow. That's why the Taoists do embryonic breathing to bring consciousness down back in the belly. And Lao Tzu says, I alone treasure feeding from the mother. I am for the belly. And so liver 3, Tai Chang, regulates the liver, promotes the free and easy flow of qi, decompresses the diaphragm to cease repression and allow a vision, a creative vision from the unconscious to arise into awareness of what we've been shutting down. So kidney deals with innate potential. Changqi is made up of kidney and stomach points, right? So kidney is innate potential rising, and the stomach is acquired potential descending. So the stomach qi descends, and that nutrition that we get from life in the form of water, food, and air has to descend, and also life experience, relationships with other human beings, relationships with the world. So life experience as earth descends in the well, and as the earth descends to nourish, increasingly higher aspects of potential are liberated from the kidney meridian, right? And then we get to the top of Chang as the channel, but then there's an upper Chang that arises through the upper kidney points in the chest, which is really this spirit and soul realm and the spirit burial ground and the subtle realm and the transition from being an ego in the world, actualizing physical potential and being a body ego, and then a membership ego, and then a rational ego, and eventually having the basis to shift to become more than an ego, to become a soul, and eventually a spirit, as our identity shifts to these subtle and increasingly subtle dimensions. So we can choose points on Rendu and Chang that are commensurate with the stage of shadow, and we can, as local points, and are commensurate with the stage of shadow that we want to liberate. So, and we can do that in relationship to the chakras. Now, the chakras, again, first chakra being survival and reflexive, and the second chakra being sexual and instinctual, and the third chakra being power dynamics and impulsive, are stages of development of consciousness in individuals and stages of development of cultures based on the value systems of those chakras. So it should be pretty obvious that any small tribe living in a jungle in Africa or the Amazon is at a survival stage. They're 24/7, something's trying to eat them, and they have to get up every day and they have to hunt and they have to gather, right? At the earliest stages of human evolution. And individual and cultural development comes up from there, from their survival motive. So we're painting with a broad brush here by seeing the chakras and correlating them with general stages of human, individual, and cultural development. But the points on the Ren, Du, and Shang are more nuanced. They're more greatly articulated than just having a first, second, third, or fourth chakra. We have whole series of points dividing those transitions up into greater nuance. And if I were to write a next book, that would be the book that I would write. And I'm not writing that book. Maybe Alexandra Love will write that book. So we'll see, but I'm pretty well done writing. So I'm going to point to this work here, and the appendix in my green book elaborates it in some detail. Basically, the appendix of the green book is an outline of the next book I would write if I were ever going to write another book again, which I don't think I'm going to do. So we have points on Ren, Du, and Chang. We can consider those points in relationship to the lower points being relative to early stages of the early shadow that is compromising the consolidation of the later stage of development, which will be relatively higher, which was an person's average stage of development. So we can choose points in relationship to the lower shadow of the chakra, where that shadow is coming from. We can choose points on Ren, Du, and Chang in relationship to average stages, and then we can choose points in relationship to leading edges. So the average stage of development, the goal with the average stage of development is to help it consolidate. And by resolving shadow, the average stage can healthfully consolidate to be a healthy, integrated part of the self structure, which now forms the ground for a person to stand on for a new and a higher beginning, for the higher emergence and the beginning of appearance of their leading edge to start to consolidate, rather than just being a higher state experience, to actually start to become a lived experience and a ground within the person, not just something they see when they're on retreat or they meditate, or a higher potential that happens when they take ayahuasca or do whatever, but actually start to open up so that the values of that higher leading edge, the more subtle values, become integrated into the self as a stage. So what we want to do with the average stage is consolidate it, help a person live up to their professed worldview. And only when an individual is living up to their professed worldview does the actual ground form for moving forward into a higher worldview. Most of your patients' average stages of development are going to be above the diaphragm. It's very unlikely you're going to treat a person whose average stage of development is survival. The only people you would treat at that stage of development is going to be an infant or a person with dementia. You're probably not going to treat anybody in an isolated tribe down in the Amazon or in some little island off of Africa, somewhere where there are 27 people living who are untouched by civilization, right? So the only people at the survival stage you could treat would be an infant or somebody with dementia. You're probably not going to really treat somebody who is strictly at a magical stage of development. That person, I mean, the people you'll treat who are at a magical stage, purely a magical stage, will be 3 to 7, 8-year-olds, whatever age you are, up to the age that you start suspecting Santa Claus isn't real. But you're not going to really treat anybody from a culture that's at that stage of development. That would be relatively unlikely to meet people like that in the continental United States. You'd have to be working with indigenous tribes somewhere that were significantly untouched by modern technology. And you're probably not working with that many people who are like Genghis Khan. The people you're working with like Genghis Khan are going to be 2 to 4-year-olds who are throwing temper tantrums. You're not going to, the closest you're going to get to working with people like Genghis Khan are going to be treating gang members, or people who are working in the mafia or drug cartels. And the people in the mafia would have to be the grunts and the foot soldiers. The people who run it now are far more sophisticated than they were back in the 20s, 30s, and 40s in America. To set up what they set up in the 40s and 50s in Las Vegas was much more significantly advanced than the capacities that Genghis Khan and those marauding tribes had. So to work with people really at that stage of development, you'd be dealing with the foot soldiers in gangs, or foot soldiers in, Hezbollah or Hamas, suicide bombers, the Taliban, for instance, probably the Iranian Guard, something like that, or fundamentalist religious white supremacists. And probably, I mean, while these people certainly do exist in our culture, probably not that many of them are coming for holistic health and acupuncture treatment. So we want to consolidate the average age. We can pick points in the area of unresolved shadow. That's going to be the lower areas. So we can clean up obstructions of qi, damp, wind, cold, phlegm that are plaguing the first 3 or 4 chakras, and certainly unobstruct the higher orifices too. It's just that most of the shadow, again, that we're dealing with is going to be lower. If you have a patient who's at a 6th or 7th chakra stage of development, and when they regress, they start seeing things pluralistically through postmodern view, it's not too bad. Most of us are dealing with rational and postmodern people who, when they regress, are like infants throwing temper tantrums. And so we're dealing with that early shadow. So we pick points for the average stage to consolidate and make that stage healthy. We pick points in the areas of unresolved shadow to unobstruct and resolve pathogens there. And we can tonify the upright influences there to burn through those pathogens. And, often these will be points in the lower chow. The average stage of development for most people you treat is going to generally be above the diaphragm. And then we want to pick points for the leading edge. And for the leading edge, we can open entry-exit points on the head. We can open windows to the sky. And we can choose spirit points and points on the head to empower insight. And we'll talk about windows in a little while in this class. So we can pick points for the average stage, points in the area of unresolved shadow, points for the leading edge on the head, and then we want to ease repression and open up the diaphragm, open up dimi. Diaphragm and dimi both are can obstruct connection between consciousness and the unconscious below. I talked about that. And the diaphragm and dimi can, particularly the diaphragm, can through resonance be reflected in stagnation at the ankles, the knees, the hips and the groin, the belly button, CV12 relative to digestion, and earth, CV14 and 15, relative to the heart, CV17 relative to the heart and lungs, the throat, the mouth, the eyes, and ultimately at the crown of the head. So we can open up the diaphragm and we can open up dimi to unrepress where the repression is, but we also want to notice where in the body is a person holding and constricting, and that can be anywhere from the ankles all the way to GV20, the crown. and we can treat the commensurate levels. So needle technique is based on the pulse. We treating excess and deficiency. Tonification promotes movement, and sedation and dispersion eases the intensity of repression and helps smooth stagnation and dissipate heat from overwork. And that overwork in this context arises from the conflict between upright influences of Jing, Qi, and Shen, pushing to assert themselves and manifest and bring content and awareness. That's the upright rising force coming into contact with the repressive force of trying to keep content from awareness. So tonification means promoting the strength of the rising force, and sedation means dispersing the intensity of repression, essentially. So because I learned essentially 5-element acupuncture, when I studied with Leon, I learned pulse diagnosis and physiology and a lot of herbs, but I really didn't learn too much acupuncture from Leon. Leon was very seriously influenced in his acupuncture by the Worsley 5-element tradition. He always threw in a little of this and a little of that he got from all these different kind of places. But he really had incorporated the 5 elements, and that's how I met him, was when he was down at the school I went to studying 5-element system with the teachers at that school. And he used to come to see patients with me to learn how I was applying the 5-element system. So I didn't get too much from Leon relative to acupuncture, much more about physiology and herbs. So basically, my basic approach is 5-element constitutional approaches. It's the backbone of what I do, in conjunction with a very deep understanding of Chinese physiology. So as I learned Leon's pulse system, I interpreted it continually through the Worsley tradition and the 5-element tradition, and learned the physiology in relationship to that. Now, here we have a chart of substitute gratifications by stage. So every stage has an addiction and a substitute gratification, something it accepts in place of union, authentic union. So for the earliest stages, the archaic stages, it's thumb sucking to regress back into an autistic state. So as the senses are opening and the infant is starting to discern the difference between self and other, and they're afraid of the incipient ego rising to make that distinction of becoming an individual, being taken out of this embryonic womb, and the eyes are beginning to focus and the ears are beginning to focus, they suck their thumb to induce that oxytocin to sink back into the archaic and an autistic state. And at the second chakra, which is sexuality, the fantasy is the substitute gratification for union. And I'm sure everybody understands what I mean when I say at the second chakra, which is sexuality, fantasy is the substitute gratification for authentic union. This is a magic stage of development, and it's a borderline stage of development where people who are at a magical stage are half in and half out. There's no difference between waking and dreaming life for them at all. Dreams are every bit as real and solid as waking life. And to say that, I am not arguing that dreams aren't as real. It's just they're not as concretely real. And people at that stage of development don't know that. For people at that stage of development, what happens in dreams is really happening, which is why when you get to membership level, there's a complete repression of the unconscious and the lower, because people think if they have a thought or they have a dream that they're doing something that the good book tells them is unwholesome, that they're sinning. It's the same thing as actually having done it. So the third stage is impulsive, and the person's and power becomes the substitute gratification for union. And this is the imperial 2 to 4-year-old stage, which is narcissistic. Buy me the tea set. Get me the dolly. I want to go on the slide again before we go home. I don't want to leave now. I don't want to go to the museum, and throwing a complete and utter screaming temper tantrum. That's Genghis Khan. Those are below the diaphragm. Above the diaphragm, we have membership. And the substitute gratification in membership is neurosis, which is doing all these rituals neurotically for reasons a person doesn't even know what this is, just what we do. So, on the third Sunday of every month, under the full moon, we face southwest and cover our body in chicken fat and juggle 3 gerbils while reciting this page of the text. Why do we do that? Well, I don't know. That's what we've always done. So it's neurosis becomes the substitute gratification. Shibboleths, just doing rituals for the sake of doing rituals, but they become empty of any actual real potency and significance. They just become technique. In the rational stage of development, self-esteem becomes the substitute gratification for wholeness. And the mantra becomes, you can do it. You can do it. If you're not selling a lot of soap, it's because you don't believe that you can sell soap. Rah, 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 go, 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 go. Right? So in postmodern stage of development, the substitute gratification for wholeness is entertaining many perspectives and just deconstructing all of them. You can see the weaknesses and the strength in every perspective, but you deconstruct every perspective and you say that all perspectives are just perspectives, so they're all equal. And they're not real because they're all created. They're all created. Right? So none of them are real, and everyone is just as real as every other one. Go with the flow, chill. I don't live in a world of shoulds, right? In holistic and integral stages of development, the substitute gratification is systems thinking, metasystemic thought. Metasystemic theories, advanced systems theory, just making connections and making connections and making connections and making connections and elaborating the intricacies of everything's relationship to everything else. And that's why you go on an integral side and people are writing these 30-page essays, and every paragraph has 20 words with 4 to 7 syllables in it. And it's impossible. I don't even know what the hell they're talking about. I read some of these things and they're talking to 3 people on the planet. I don't know what they're talking about. As complex as any of the material I've ever written is, it was always my goal to take very complex material and speak about it in a way that a person of some reasonable intelligence could, if they cared enough, understand. And yet, after 40 years of reading integral theory, I read some of their stuff and I don't know, if I was going to spend the time to do this, I'd rather learn jazz guitar or study classical Chinese because it's more interesting. So the substitute gratification at the next shock in the early transpersonal stages is visioning, and just having visions and the boundless soaring of the Hun. And doing ayahuasca every month and having to have experience after experience after experience after experience after experience until you become completely lost in just the Bardo realm. And of course, all that stuff winds up with the person gets very windy and their Shen gets scattered from blowing their Jing and their heart apart from doing all these practices. And the same thing can happen with too much Qigong, too much Tai Chi, too much meditation. I once meditated 12 hours and 15 minutes without moving, and it took about 4 months to get back into my body. Really, seriously. So if a person is pushing that area and mistaking it for final union, just having visions and having experience all the time, they can just get windy, muscle tremors, dissociated, difficulty focusing, anything you'd associate with scattered Shen. And the final stage of development is just getting addicted to witnessing and bliss. And the person gets addicted to being detached. And I've known teachers, Amritasaya Kripalu was just totally addicted to his detachment and truly and authentically believed he was beyond the reach of karma, that he was completely free beyond karma, because he was so identified with the witness position. And a friend of mine asked him years after he was thrown out of Kripalu for sleeping with 5 of the women there when he was giving a celibate teaching, what's the one thing he most missed about the community? And his answer was, my daily massage. He was just completely addicted to being detached and addicted to bliss. And still is, as far as I can tell. It's probably 91 or 2 now, and I last saw him about 3 years ago and hadn't changed. So again, we want to consider the trailing stage of development, which is where the shadow is stored. Where in the body is it stored? Does it come up as reflexes? Does it come up as and thumb sucking? Does it oral fixations? Does it come up as fantasy and sexuality and daydreaming and sexual fantasies? Does it come up, that second chakra, does it come up third chakra as an impulsiveness? And do they regress to this like impulsiveness and the screaming and temper tantrums? Do they regress to like a member? Are they postmodern, but they regress when they get upset to sort of a membership, you're in or you're out, you're with us, you're against us kind of view? So where does it come from? Where in the body is that? And do points for that. Also do points for the average stage of development on channel, local points for the average stage that get to that area, and distal points that would activate that area. So for instance, if I want to treat someone in the upper chow or around the diaphragm, CV14 and 15, I might do CV15, for instance, to open up this area around the diaphragm, but I might activate it with pericardium 6. Okay, so, and then do points on the leading edge, and those are generally going to be in the upper chow, in the higher aspects, in the leading edge of where the person is, to help give them insight into their deeper view, and all the while keeping the diaphragm open so what's above can communicate with what's below. So, and that doesn't mean in every treatment we have to do points for the lower stage, the average stage, the upper stage. But over the course of treatments, just as we're resolving stagnations, we're generally dealing with what's lower. And as we resolve stagnations, communication is being promoted. So shadow should be being resolved, and we should commensurately be working with the person with that shadow. So if a person's earth constitution, and we're working with eating disorder, a history of eating disorders and oral fixations, we can be working with things around the first chakra, right? To resolve shadow around the first chakra and to open up. And between first and second chakra in a nuanced way. So we might do points like kidney 14, I think is kidney 13 or 14 is door of infants. So we can do door of infants and open that up while doing distal kidney points. In other treatments, we can work on the average stage of development, which might have more to do with, and we can also, for them with eating disorders, work on their earth and work with integration and look at what beliefs they have around food and what beliefs they have around themselves and look at that early dimension of life and help them understand it and help them reframe it and help them see how certain behaviors were compensations, which help them, but they don't need anymore. And then we can do points for average stage of development, which might for a person be postmodern, to see ways in which they're not really pluralistic and can't entertain multiple points of view. So maybe they have, for instance, a very hard view of what happened to them when they were young and how things are. And we want to say, but you uphold taking multiple perspectives everywhere else in your life and being able to see through the eyes of others. Can you see through the eyes of these different parts of yourself? Can you look at it? Is there a different way you can understand everything that happened? So in my first book, Nourishing Destiny, and then I'm sure I repeated it in clinical practice, I say that when we're offering suggestions to people, it's really helpful to offer them in a language, in their own language, in a language they're familiar with, and make those suggestions the natural extension of things that they already believe. So we can help them consolidate the stage, their average stage of development, by living up to what they profess to believe there. And then in other treatments, we can treat the leading edge, and generally that's going to be done with points on the head, upper kidney points, points on the head, spirit points, and windows of the sky, all of which are points that bring insight and unrepress, to allow the consolidation of higher capacities, to bring light down into the depth so that they can look from their average stage of development upon the lower stages with illumination and compassion. So for every dynamic and issue, water always sets intention. Wood provides perspective. Fire provides compassion and passion. Earth will always help in digestion to abstract meaning from experience. And metal will always help to let go of what no longer serves for the sake of receiving essence. Okay, so here we have a breakdown of deficiencies, stagnations, and excesses, and we can look at how to understand them in a subtle way. And we want to understand them as they're at once all of this language of Chinese physiology is real and metaphor. And metaphor is real. Metaphor is potent. Metaphor is powerful. Metaphor is incredibly powerful therapeutically. I talk about the healing dimension of metaphor, I think, in my Red Clinical Practice text, that one of the main things we can do is therapeutically is create a metaphor for someone that helps to make a connection between their pathology, their beliefs, their behaviors, and their higher aspirations. Now, the patient is always enacting metaphors that make connections between all those two things, and the art of diagnosis is the art of being able to read those metaphors. And the pathology expresses itself through metaphors as behavior, signs, and symptoms. And we give medicine as metaphors. So herbs are real and acupuncture points are real, and they're also metaphors. So when we do wilderness mound, okay, there's a certain relation, gallbladder 40, there's a certain relationship between tendons and nerves and muscle that the point is, but there's also wilderness mound and the image of a hill and going up at 300 and going up it to escape the forest so we can see the trees and see where we've been, where we are, where we're going, and get a 360-degree perspective. So we want to look at how all these physiological conditions are enacted, how are they projected, and what miasms are they identified with. A miasm is, as I discussed, I think in the first or second class, and you should certainly look it up in my green book in Dimensions of the Self and read about miasms. It's a term from homeopathy, and I use it to just mean an unhealthy relationship between a thought, a feeling, a sensation, an emotion, a belief, and a behavior that is held together, that the most significant force holding it together, cohering it into an apparent reality, is the patient's own attention, invested in an unwholesome way into it as a habit. So what are those, the miasms, the unhealthy relationship between thought, feeling, emotions, and behaviors and beliefs? What is that miasm for the patient? And how does the investment of belief and attention into it sustain it? And to what degree is that sustenance of this unhealthy dynamic held in place by shadow? And how can we characterize that dynamic in terms of the language of Chinese physiology? So everything on this page, all these categories are terms in Chinese physiology that have gross, subtle, and very subtle dimensions to them. Qi deficiency means the lack of capacity to do work. So we're going through the deficiencies. So when we talk about Qi, it's sort of mythologized into this mysterious cosmic force. And, I've done Qigong. I first learned Qigong, interestingly, in a workshop with a man named Paul Gallagher, who translated the Tai Chi classics, who was a professor at my college. And I knew Paul in the 1970s. He died recently. lived in Asheville the end of his life, but he was the main student of a man named T.T. Liang, and Paul translated the Tai Chi classics into English. And he sponsored Bob Flaws to give a weekend Qigong workshop sometime, probably the winter or spring of 1980. Probably spring 1980 in Amherst, Massachusetts. And so I learned 7 pieces of brocade from Bob Flaws, and I practiced that for years. I've done Qigong for 43 years, on and off, and mostly on for the last 14 or so. And I've done it, I do it every day now. Start every morning as soon as I get up with practice of Qigong. So I understand Qi as the capacity to do work. Practically speaking, Qi, there is a subjective experience of Qi, which goes into the woo-woo, and you do, and you feel the Qi ball, and you can feel Qi, and you can definitely direct it in your body and feel flow and feel warming and all of that. So I'm not diminishing that, but it's turned, when I say woo-woo, it's, it's turned in popular culture into the Star Wars Force kind of thing, where all of a sudden people believe that people can light newspapers on hands with their fires and make electrical light bulbs light up by holding them, and make things float off tables and all of that. And well, it may be true, it hasn't been in my experience. So I understand Qi is the capacity to do work. And we know in Chinese medicine, there are 5 functions of Qi: to warm, to move, to transform, to hold in place, and to protect. So there are these 5 functions. And if any of those functions are failing in the gross or subtle dimensions of the self, then we can say that there is a relative lack of Qi, which manifests as lack of capacity to do work. So yin deficiency occurs through excess. So how do we get Qi? There are 2 ways to really get Qi deficient. And they're the same ways we become yang deficient. So I'll talk about Qi deficiency when I talk about yang deficiency. Yin deficiency, we either have a fire that rips through us, like COVID, and your temperature is 103 degrees or 104 degrees for a week, 3 days or 5 days or a week. And we have this external fire that just burns its way through us. Or the internal cause of yin deficiency is from excess identification with thoughts and emotions. I see these people on Facebook going on and on and on and on and on about how great emotion is and being in touch with emotion, and I'm an emotional being. And it's true that if you're a materialist at a rational stage of being, and you and your culture have been repressing the unconscious all your life, getting in touch with feelings is a very important thing, because you've basically been surviving by repressing reflexes, instincts, and impulses, and therefore shoving emotions down and being a materialist and just being rational, like Mr. Spock on Star Trek, right? So at that stage of development, getting in touch with feelings, sort of regressing in the service of transcendence, it's called, getting in touch with the earlier stages and ceasing repressing them, and getting in touch with feelings and being able to name them and identify what we're feeling and where we're feeling it in our body. That's very impressive for people who are at mythic membership or a rational stage of development, because they're completely and utterly repressed, right? All the membership traditions are deeply, deeply repressive, and mental rationality shoves down the irrational. It's scared of the monster under the bed. The monster under the bed is our own unconscious. But at later stages of development, we can see that thought and feeling, by the time we get into second-tier holistic and integral stages of development, thought and feeling are just objects in awareness. They have no personal nature. They're not unique. They're just weather that moves, no different from the external weather. It's just internal weather. So chi moves outside of us. There's the daily light cycle, and there's seasonal change and changes in weather, and chi moves inside of us. There are emotions, there are thoughts, there are feelings, there are sensations, and there are objects in awareness, and they are not self. They occur in a field of awareness as subtle objects. So the table my computer's sitting on, and the chair I'm sitting in, and the trees I see outside of my window are gross objects in awareness that have mass. And the thoughts, feelings, emotions, and sensations I have are subtle objects in my awareness. Their physiological substrate can be measured on oscilloscopes, but the actual subjective experience of them can't be found. Hasn't been found, and I don't think will ever be found as a thing that has mass and exists in time and in space. So yin deficiency comes with over-identification with thoughts and feeling. As a gross generalization that is generally true, broadly true, men tend to be relatively more over-identified with thought, which has relatively more to do with the movements of qi and yang. And women are relatively more overly identified with emotion and feeling, which has relatively more to do with blood. And by men and women, I mean people and men are people in bodies with lots of testosterone, and they have penises. And women have vaginas and tend to have a lot of estrogen, right? So I'm talking in that binary way. And it is my experience that when transgendered men, women people born women and told they're women who identify as being men and then become men and start taking testosterone, they start to actually identify more and more strongly with thought and become more and more visual and become much more visually aroused as men do. Men are very, very, very visual and triggered by visual things, right? Relatively more, just relatively. I'm only speaking relatively here. So that doesn't mean that men don't have an unwholesome relationship and investment in emotion, and that women don't have an unwholesome investment in thought. It's just that men relatively more thought and women relatively more feeling. Based on it's totally physiologically programmed, genetically programmed. So yang deficiency, so we become yin deficient through over-identification with thoughts and feeling, and we can become yin deficient through doing too much intellectual work. So when you see, if you have my 3 books and you put them on your shelf, well, there's 40% of my, well, 30% of my kidney function was used writing them. I'm serious. So yang deficiency, in contrast, comes from doing too much physical work or having an inborn weakness. So we can become we are qi and yang deficient either because we didn't get enough at conception, or we overworked physically in relationship to capacity. None of you are overworking physically now. I mean, unless you're listening to this on a podcast and jogging and lifting weights. Most of you, anyone who's sitting in a chair watching this and listening to this, the only way you're overworking physically is if you have high blood pressure, or if you ate a big meal and your body's working to digest it while you listen to this. Now you're working intellectually and emotionally. Physical overwork is moving boxes and lifting heavy things and doing long distance biking, swimming, and running, and heavy martial arts training, and lifting weights and carrying packages and shoveling dirt. So we become yang deficient either because we didn't get enough yang at conception, or we physically overwork in relationship to our capacity. So blood deficiency means that we're undernourished. And generally, the pulse is thin. But if it's thin, thin means a very small diameter and soft and yielding. And generally, we can push through it. And if it's thin in any one position, that means that organ is blood deficient. So if the left distal pulse is thin, that's heart blood deficiency. If the middle distal middle, if the left middle position is thin, that's liver blood deficiency, and so on. If both sides are thin, the person is generally undernourished, malnourished. And then we have to look into the reasons of malnourishment. Were they raised in poverty? Were they just not taken care of? Or do they ignore their own needs? Do they eat bad quality food? Do they not take time to eat? Do they eat in the car when they're driving from appointment to appointment? You know, this sort of thing, so that assimilation is compromised. So now we can look at the stagnations. Blood stagnation is the repression of memory. It is hiding contact from ourselves. Blood carries Shen, and hardened blood means there's content that we're hiding from ourselves. There's separation. We're saying, this is not me, and we're hardening it and putting it away. And the pain that comes from that separation, the pain is the voice of the content calling to us for attention, so we can learn from it, integrate it into ourselves, and let go of our attachment to and not commensurate our attachment to with commensurate denial of the circumstances that led to it. Qi stagnation means that an organ has the capacity to do work. It's working to move a gross or subtle obstacle. A gross obstacle could be a scar across a meridian, a hematoma. It could be excess food in the digestive tract. It could be too much stool in the bowel. So the body is working to move that gross obstacle, but a subtle obstacle could be a belief or a thought. I'm ugly, I'm pretty, I'm smart, I'm stupid. I'm the greatest, I'm the worst. I can sing, I can't sing. Just some kind of self-image, some kind of belief is a subtle obstacle that can be obstructing us for years. That belief could be, I was sexually abused by my uncle when I was 6 years old, and my uncle's dead, so it's impossible to ever reconcile this. Well, that's just a thought. It isn't true. The best, deepest, and most meaningful part of ourselves is always free, already, regardless of what's happened, because what happened never happened to it. And that's always available. So the idea that I can't heal because, or I can't heal yet because, or I'm not whole now because, those are all just thoughts. I'll be whole someday, I'll be enlightened, I'll have union someday, but not right now, because first I have to X, Y, Z. That's all just a thought. So that's a subtle obstacle. That's obstruction. So we want to know, is the obstacle gross or subtle? And what is its, if it's gross, what is its subtle correlate? And if it's subtle, what is its gross correlate? Which means that everything that is physical has to have subtle psychic and soul implications, with implications for this lack of transparency and receptivity to spirit. And everything that's subtle, every psychic and every soul structure and issue we have is some way has to be physically embodied. So we want to know in terms of the obstacle, when did it arise? What happened? Oh, I fell off my bike. I have a hematoma. Where did the belief arise from? Well, the first thing I remember is, I was 4 years old or 6 years old or 8 years old, and I was standing there, and my uncle was there, and my mother was there, and my cousin was there, and this person did this, and this person did that, and this is what it meant to me. And that what it meant was a meaning constructed by a 4, 6, an 8, a 10, a 12, a 14-year-old with an incomplete data set and nowhere near a top-down view broad enough to be able to actually contextualize the meaning of what happened in a wholesome way so that it could serve. And now it's the adult's job to do that now. Damp stagnation is either due to environment, living in a house with a damp basement, or living in a place that's humid all the time, or it's due to excess food consumption, too much sugar, too much dairy in one form or another, which is the excessive seeking for comfort, and that seeking for comfort becomes fat, and fat isn't muscle. The function of digestion is to learn from life experience and integrate it into the self and create blood to nourish muscles so we can do good work out in the field of life. And the presence of dampness is proof that we're changing potential sources of nourishment into burden. And we talked about this in the 5-element class. This usually has a lot to do with oral fixations and a need to work around the belly button, the nipples, the breasts, and the mouth. Heat stagnation. Heat comes from friction, from the effort exerted against an unmoving obstacle, right? So when heat can come from overwork. So when there's chi stagnation and the chi is pushing against an obstacle that's not moving, heat is generated, and that heat fuels belief and unwholesome investment into the apparent reality of the obstacle that we're pushing against. And that heat is unfulfilled desire. So heat we see in the eyes, on the eye, the inner eyelid, where there's lots of red and the vessels are thickening in the eyelid, and heat, red tongue, and a red tip to the tongue. That red tip to the tongue is unfulfilled desire. And unfulfilled desire is either there's something I feel compelled to do that my superego won't let me do because it's unwholesome and I'm afraid of the consequences. If only I could do X, Y, Z, then I'd be whole, right? So that often plays out in terms of if only I had this, if I had this many patients, if I was earning this income. And it especially plays out because heat is very much related to that second chakra and sexuality and the heat and the passion of sex. It often plays out as sexual fantasies. And only if I could do this and only if I could do that would I be whole. Those are generally unwholesome because they're either engaged, eat the Jolly Donut and keep walking down the street, but don't spend the rest of your life staring at in the bakery window and be done with it. Or it's unwholesome because let's say a person is queer. Let's say they're gay, or let's say they're a lesbian, but their membership tradition tells them it's unwholesome to do that. So their superego won't let them, or they're transgendered and their superego won't let them acknowledge the integrity and the truth of who and what they actually are at a soul level. They don't feel they can act upon it. In that case, it's not the desire to do the thing that is unwholesome. It is the inhibition of acting in a way that has integrity to one's deeper realization on the path to manifesting one's destiny and self-actualization of the self, which is a necessary step, is the ultimate necessary step necessary for transcendence of the self, is first its self-actualization. So heat can come from the unfulfilled desire of wanting to enact something, but not letting oneself do it because one is ashamed of or afraid of the consequences. Unfulfilled desire can also come through repetitively doing the same thing over and over again. My ego told me that if only I could do X, Y, Z, then I'd be whole. But now I need to do it over and 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 over again. And, you know, we can understand that in relationship to addictions and pornography, but it's also true for a lot of seekers. I need another darshan. I need more ayahuasca. I need another retreat because I know that I'm not enlightened now. Right here, right now. No, I know I'm not enlightened now. I know I don't have union now. I know I'm not whole now. And how do I know? Because there are dimensions of my experience that are unpleasant. And if I was whole, everything would be perfect and I would be happy and I would be in bliss and I wouldn't feel angry and I wouldn't feel sad and I wouldn't be confused and I wouldn't have shame anymore. None of that's true. You don't have to take my word for it. I'm just trying to help. But the part of ourself that is offering us up the proof now that we're not there yet, that's what ego is. Ego needs more time. So it's no, you're not there yet. Still need another hit, baby. Another darshan. Need more unconditional love. Got to go get hugged by Ma. need another one. But whatever it is, it's never going to be now. It's always going to be at some future point. So excess, heat in the blood tends to manifest as being irritated, being irritating. It's most associated with the liver through can be digestion, can be stomach over. Certainly eating too fast and too much will make the stomach overwork. And that will create heat as digestion overworks. And that heat will create a state of yin deficiency and an endless appetite in the stomach. But all the blood goes to the liver and goes through the liver, and heat can get in the blood through the liver's frustration and anger and resentments. So heat in the blood can manifest in desire and can manifest as aggression. And that can be sexual aggression because the liver is the only channel that goes through the genitals. Fire manifests as unfulfilled desire, burning desires. Physically, that can be high blood pressure generated by heat in the heart, but it can also come out as shingles. What's the main point for shingles? Well, it's the outer point just below the heart shoe point. It's called whale of grief. And it's the main point for shingles. And for shingles, draining aggressive energy is great, and especially treating that point or doing superficial needling of that point is very helpful. And shingles is just heart fire bursting out, heart and small intestine fire, but primarily heart bursting out through the skin. This can manifest as women particularly, who get UTIs every time they have sex, because even if they're having sex with a partner that they love consensually, the agitation and the excitement agitates and triggers something in the heart that needs to be resolved. And so the heart gets agitated by the intimacy, and the heat goes from the heart to the small intestine to the bladder, and then you get that burning. So external fire, true excess, external fire, which manifests as heat in the blood and damp heat in the blood, can very much, so bladder infections or people who are really prone to poison ivy, poison oak, poison sumac, and they get these festering damp heat conditions, that kind of fire can manifest the kind of fire you give gentiana drained liver soup to, very cold liver herbs, manifests as bitterness and resentment. So, and damp heat in the lower chow, festering resentment. I've often given Wulin San to, you can give it for bladder infections, and it's it's probably the main formula I've used for bladder infections. There are 5 different formulas I use, but on average, Wulin San is the main one. That's gardenia and holin, and gardenia is for damp heat, and damp heat are, in women, it's more bladder infections, and for men, prostatitis. And it's often correlated in people with chronic conditions like this as like jealousy and a festering resentment against something or someone. And cold creates contraction and fear. Cold creates contraction and fear. And so while the heart is open and can embrace all these higher, more nuanced and subtle possibilities of transcendence and these higher aspirations, fear tends to shut that down and constrict our concerns, causing us to regress back down to, first chakra sort of issues of survival and self-concern. So I'm going through these slides, obviously, kind of quickly, and I could, when I go through my herb course, I differentiate all the herbs in terms of these conditions and all the formulas, and then elaborate all these syndrome patterns in terms of how individual herbs and the collective formula can address them, and we don't have time for that here. But most of you are acupuncturists, and you understand the functions of points and herbs in relationship to all these things, or at least you did for the 3 hours that you took your NCCO exam. But anybody who stayed in practice, obviously, then that intellectual knowledge starts to become real. The way I took a 2-year class in herbs, but I learned herbs by prescribing herbs to people. This is just a depiction of the diaphragm. So here's the muscle. Here are some important physiological relationships between the diaphragm and specific acupuncture points. You can see that the exit and entry points on the chest all are over the heart. So liver 14 to lung 1 is the only one that takes chi through the diaphragm, but you can see that they're all bringing it through the heart. Spleen 21 to heart 1, liver 14 to lung 1, kidney 22 to pericardium 1. Here's the upper kidney points, which deal with Shen and Ling, and the relationship between the Shen as spirit and the Ling as a vehicle for spirit, Ling being soul. And here's pericardium 6 and triple heater 5, the inner and outer frontier gate that open up this area around CV14 all the way to CV17. Kidney 16 is the root of the Gao Huang area that Gao Huang Shu treats. Gao Huang Shu being on either the outer point of the pericardium. And it relates, the Gao Huang is the area around the heart. And this is a place, I talk about this in my red book under Gao Huang Shu, under bladder 43, and you should all read up on that point, and I give you a diagram there. So kidney 16 is the source of the Gao Huang, and the root of the Gao Huang, and CV15 is the source point for the Gao Huang and the source of that area. In addition to, in Worsley's tradition, being the one of the 2 mu points for the pericardium, the other one being CV17. So it's interesting that this isn't a moot point in TCM for the pericardium. I don't know why that is. It could just be because that's what some people decided in a room. But at any rate, being the source of the Gao Huang and Gao Huang Shu being the outer point of pericardium certainly establishes a functional connection between CV15 and pericardium. So you can read on opening the diaphragm in clinical practice on page 130. Everything above the diaphragm is conscious, and below is the unconscious. And you can read on herbs that open the diaphragm in clinical practice 129 to 131, and in deepening perspective 355 to 357. I cover Ban Sha Ho Pu Tang and Ban Sha She Shen Tang. In my herb class and clinical integration class, I spend long time on these two formulas, and I'm not going to differentiate them much here, except to say Ban Sha Ho Pu Tang opens up the diaphragm by opening up the lateral dimension, and Ban Sha She Shen Tang by opening up the vertical dimension. I don't know why this text up here is kind of grayed out, but at least you can read it. Ban Sha Ho Pu Tang relaxes the diaphragm, tension in the esophagus and in the heart, and tension in the throat, Plum Pit Chi. This is a character for Plum Pit Chi. It's the character for not, no, bu, over a mouth, under a radical for sickness. It's the sickness of not being able to take anything in one's mouth because one can't swallow. One's throat is tight, one's chest is tight, and one loses one's appetite. Losing the appetite is Ban Sha She Shen Tang, and that's for heart sickness. It's for not being able to sort things out, being half in, half outside of a relationship, in a love-hate relationship with someone or something. And you love them and you hate them, and you're running hot and cold, and the hot and cold bind, and they bind at CV14 and CV15, and you just feel like this, you got a knife there and it's just being twisted. So these are just herb formulas that move blood in the different chows that you can use. And I'm sure anybody who's learned herbs has learned all of these formulas. There's a little bit of overlap between them, of course. So Zhui Fu Zhu Tang treats the heart, but it also treats the head. So it treats the upper chow, but it also treats blood stagnation in the head. So it's very good for concussions and cerebral hematomas, or just headaches that come from stagnant blood in the head. So wherever we have stagnant blood, we want to look at where is it in the body, and what kind of content would a person be keeping from themselves in that area of the body. So obviously in the lower chow, it could have to do with survival, sexuality, and issues of power. In the middle chow with digestion and assimilation. And in the toward the upper of the middle chow, it could have begins to get to membership. In the upper chow, it can have to do with membership and belonging. And it can also have to do with the emergence of rationality and materialism and repressing the heart because of materialism. In the bottom of the sixth chakra, it can have to do with pluralism and the beginnings of self-actualization. And the top of the sixth chakra having more to do with holism and integrations and stagnations there. And in the head, always in terms of what, headaches, what we don't want to see, what we don't want to let in, what we can't take in, what we won't see, what we won't hear. So these are just some formulas. Again, I go through these in my herb class. There's not really time to go through them now. Damp is air Chantang resolves damp. It can be modified to go to the different orifices. I love the formula for the upper chow, which Thea Elijah wrote a couple pages on in my red book in the herb chapter on combining air Chantang by adding adding Shi Chang Pu. And I talk about that. Thea presents that in clinical practice on page 155. It says P155. It's page 155. Yeah. So so the Shi Chang Pu takes the urchin tongue up to the sensory orifices for a person who's just thick in the head and they have a lot of inertia and it's also complicated. And I just can't understand what you're saying and they're confused and they have a lot of digestive issues and small intestine types of sorter issues. And this formula opens the sensory orifices, clears them of the headaches so they can start to see and start to transform and start to understand what it is they've been hiding from themselves with dampness. For the middle chow, obviously there are all the formulas based on Sijan Sitang, 4 gentlemen, 6 gentlemen, 8 treasure, Sichuan Dabuwan, Big Ten complete pill, ginseng nourishing combination, all of those kind of formulas. I love the prosperous farmer formula that Ted Kapchik wrote for the middle chow. This can only be given to someone who's cold. If they're hot, this will be too hot for them. But it wonderfully transforms the middle chow and gets digestion moving so a person can then process, digest, interjects, and then integrate the lesson they had to learn while moving on. Lower chow, Guizhou Fuling Wan, which is the version I like is Women's Chamber from Con Herbs. And also as I talk, so that will resolve phlegm masses and also congealed blood masses in the lower chow. And gardenia and holland can be very good for the chronic prostatitis or bladder infections in the lower chow with resentment or pain. For stagnant heat, Coptis is the formula. Coptis for unfulfilled desire that goes to heat in the heart. It's included in the formula lotus seed decoction. Lotus seed decoction to clear the heart, Qing Xin Lian Zi Yin. I love that formula. It's also in Bancha Sheishan Tong. I love those 2 formulas. You can look them up in my green book. And Coptis treats fawn, and fawn is a picture of somebody's head on fire. So it reminds me of the talking heads. I can't seem to face up to the facts. I'm tense and nervous and I can't relax. I can't sleep because my bed's on fire. Don't touch me, I'm a real live wire. And for fawn, we can change that to I can't sleep because my head's on fire. And that brings us to Windows of the Sky. So I'm just going to take a break for a moment and I'll be right back. Okay, so let's discuss windows of the sky. Windows of the sky are discussed in chapters 2 and 21 of the Ling Shu. It is my opinion that everyone who practices Chinese medicine should own and have read Paul Unschald's Neiqing, Nanqing, and Ling Shu. Minimally. I mean, this is the trinity of Chinese medicine. There are more texts being translated now, but I mean, those are the three foundations of acupuncture. One should also read the Jia Yi Jing, which has been translated, but not by Unschald. But a lot of that repeats stuff that's in these other three books. So the Ling Shu, chapter 2 and 21 gives mentions the windows of the sky all in relationship to each other. And it talks about them in relationships to extreme conditions that most of us are never going to treat. People having seizures, people with deviated eyes and tongues, and these people are having heart attacks, they're having epileptic seizures, they're having strokes, and they're having severe psychotic breaks. And the reason it's not that we're not going to treat people who've had or have those conditions. It's just that almost everybody we treat is being medicated for them and taking drugs, which are terrible for their organs, but are helping them live and keeping them alive. So the definition of a good drug, I've always said, is one that kills you more slowly than the disease you have. And while we treat people who have the conditions that are specified for these points, they're all being medicated. It's like some of the herb formulas that are for diabetes. Well, they were from people with diabetes that weren't medicated on insulin. And we don't see that. We don't see people like that in our practices. Every diabetic you've ever treated is almost all of them are taking insulin. And if they're not, they're crazy or don't have access to healthcare. So we use these points more subtly. And we can understand that the throat is the interface between the head and the body, and that the body is a metaphor generally for the unconscious and the head for consciousness. For the Chinese, the unconscious was beneath the diaphragm and the hara, sort of where the soul is located, and consciousness was above the diaphragm. But we locate the source of self in the head. And so we can understand that repression at the level of the throat, tension at the level of the throat, constriction there, we can understand it in terms of the Cartesian, I think, therefore I am, mind-body duality, materialism, and the dissociation from the body present at the modern stage of present in modernity. And the existential emptiness, ultimate emptiness of materialism in lieu of an authentic connection to soul and spirit and depth and the unconscious, and the beauty of the unconscious in generating imagery and stories and myth and the power of myth. So I understand the windows of the sky. Again, I'm not going to go into here the individual windows of the sky and how the points function. I do that in my point class, and it's all in my red book. So just go to the red book and look up, read the chapter on windows of the sky, and then go to, in the acupuncture point session, each of the windows of the sky, and you'll read all about specifically the function of that point. Just to say here that the windows are, many of the windows are upper confluent points of the divergent channels, and the divergent channels are channels of latency, as defined and described in the teachings of Jeffrey Yuen. And when an external pernicious influence is coming toward an organ, or an emotion or life event is coming toward an organ that's going to damage the organ, it gets channeled into the joints in terms of external, wind, cold, damp goes into the joints, into the divergent channel. So it doesn't hit the organ, but it goes to the joints. And then you get inflammation and arthritis and autoimmune conditions and this sort of thing. And emotions that are too powerful, that are going to damage an organ, get channeled into the blood and then hidden from consciousness in the form of repression, in the form of congealed blood. And so, and that also creates pain. So we want to work on resolving those things. And the function of the windows of the sky is that it unrepresses a specific sort of content, allowing us to, at our later stage of development, take what was repressed at a younger age and now look at it and bring to bear the top-down view of our later relatively more enlightened self, reframe it, learn from what happened, reframe it in a positive way, extract the kernel of gold of light from it to nourish ourselves, and let go of the rest and surrender what doesn't serve. And what we're surrendering is the dysfunctional interpretation the young child made to help them cope, which isn't necessary anymore for the adult to thrive. And these are just the chakras by stages of development: archaic, magic, mythic, rather archaic, archaic, magic, magic, mythic, mythic, lower fifth chakra, rational, upper pluralistic. This is where we start getting involved in self-expression and speaking our truth. And then sixth chakra, the lower part being holistic and integral consciousness, the upper part being transpersonal psychic soul consciousness, and seeing ourselves as a whole. The lower part of six is the culmination of self-actualization. And as soon as we self-actualize, we say, oh my God, what have I done? The self that I spent my whole life working so hard to become isn't real. And we start to awaken to the soul as a living reality and start to develop into the transpersonal realm, where, again, the self we're working on is a self with a capital S. It isn't self with the lower S. Now, when I say that, I, as Lonnie Jarrett, am still practicing jazz guitar because I, Lonnie Jarrett, want to get better at jazz guitar. I'm still working on photography because I want to be better at photography. But my motive for playing music and my motive for doing photography is not a personal motive. I do get enjoyment from them, but it's actually becomes a striving to create beauty and uplift the world. So it becomes less personal. And in a deeper way, I don't meditate. I don't meditate and do Qigong so much for me. I do, well, that's not true. I do Qigong for my health. but I don't meditate for myself. I stopped meditating 20 years ago because I needed relief and I needed to be calm and I wanted space from things. I meditate so I'm available and open and transparent, and I can be available to the higher and deeper motives that I've discovered for the sake of everything and everyone. And so that I can really participate and really give. So this is the transcendence of a personal motive into the transpersonal realm. And then GV20, the bottom of GV20, the seventh chakra is witness. And then the higher dimension of it is non-duality. Witness still has a witness in what's being witnessed. And the non-dual is union. So you can just consider this in relationship to the body. And I've put all these on the acupuncture charts so you can see the relationship of Chang and Ren and Du to the different centers and consider. And look, you can see so clearly here that the chakras are areas of gross distinction, and look how much more nuance the acupuncture points make in terms of the vertical ascension of the human soul and the human being. So much more nuance. So I would implore you then, please, to read as an assignment the appendix to my green book. And in that, I go through this figure in great detail, which I really don't have to, to do this would be a day. It won't take you a day to read that chapter. It's like, the appendix is like 5 pages. But that appendix is the outline of another easy 500-page book. But I'm 66. I don't want to take another 10 years writing another book. I'm free. I did it, and I'm really happy to support people. I feel so happy supporting Alexander Love to write in any capacity, to do the work that he's going to release, which will be significant. And my friend dear friend Michelle Gellis, I mentored through writing a book. I'm very happy to inspire others and mentor anyone who needs mentoring through the writing of their texts, and to let others do it. I feel I've made my contribution, but I have pointed the way forward with this appendix. So here we have Ren rising, kidney, yin rising commensurately with it, and the stomach as a funnel of what I see, what I smell, what I taste, what I hear, and what I think are all channeled down. And as this nutritional chi descends, it activates inner potentials at higher and higher and higher and higher and higher levels. And we just need to see where the obstruction is. Where's the average stage of development? Where's the leading stage of development? And where's the regressed shadow that needs to be resolved relative to each individual? Choose points appropriately. And here you can just read this, but it would be better if you read the appendix in the Deepening Perspective book. I wish I could write that book. Really, I have a pulse book to write. I have an herb book to write. And I have the book that would be this appendix to write. And it's just that it's either going to be done in another lifetime, someone else is going to do it, or maybe in this lifetime I'm letting go of Chinese medicine. And maybe, God willing, in my next lifetime, I'll get to be a really good jazz guitarist. The sun is just coming over just setting now. It's been raining here all day, and it's the 7th day of August. And the storm is coming up the coast, and it's been overcast, but the sun is just breaking through. So you see this blinding light on me now. I didn't account for that when I started this. So homework. For every physical symptom a patient has, I want you to ask yourself how it's present at subtle psychological and soul levels. Where is it in the body? What stagnations, excesses, and deficiencies are associated with it? How are they present in the person's behavior? And how are those syndrome patterns that are associated with it that need to be treated in order to resolve it manifest at a subtle psychic and soul level? How can you interact with a patient in a way to start bringing consciousness to the patterns, changing their behavior, reframing their beliefs around them? And for every subtle finding, for everything you notice in a person's behavior and color, sound, odor, and emotion, tone of voice, and belief that they have, where is that located in the body and how? I want you to contemplate your own health in this regard. The locations of the symptoms, their subtle and sometimes not so subtle manifestations, and their metaphorical nature. What would you have to change to be free of them? Now, if you have insulin-dependent diabetes, I'm not asking you, what can you just change so you don't need insulin anymore? What can you change so you can throw away your thyroxine? I'm not asking that. Now, there are many conditions that we have that we can make changes that are predicated on dysfunctional beliefs and behaviors and attitudes and thoughts, feelings, emotions, and sensations that we can take responsibility for and change. But even with diabetes, what would you have to change to be free in the face of the condition? And how great an imperative does it seem to you to change this? I had assigned in the first class, choose the one thing that you've known you should change your whole life or for years and years and years that would only have a wholesome influence on you and everyone else you exist in relationship to. Change the one thing that would change everything. And this question is related to it. So what would you have to do to be free and to change it? What beliefs would you have to let go of? What behaviors would you have to stop doing? And what would you have to start doing? How much does it matter to you? And you can tell how much it matters to you by whether or not you're actually wholeheartedly engaged with doing it now. And if it's just like something you're, well, you know, I'm kind of doing it. You know, I bit the skin around my nails my whole life. Probably because I grew up with a very aggressive, highly irrational father and was just always terrified of him. And one day, about a year ago, exactly a year ago, a friend looked at me and said, you know, you've done so much work and you've totally healed your relationship with your father, but you're still biting your fingers. You're still chewing on your fingers in that way. And you really need to completely let go of it. And in 1 second, I said, you're absolutely right. And I never, ever bit my fingers again. From that second on, I just said, you're right. And I stopped. Even with 65 years of momentum behind the behavior and having stopped successfully for weeks and months at a time and then always started again, I stopped and I didn't do it and I'll never do it again. Because I understood the significance of it. And in doing that, when I did that, my blood pressure miraculously came down and haven't had a high blood pressure in a year. Something let go. I'm done with it. And so that's what I'm pointing you to here. And please read the appendix in Deepening Perspectives. Keep contemplating introjection, projection, and and split ego states and how they manifest in yourself and in others, and keep working with the shadow. Keep being aware of when your projections come up and when you're projecting, and keep looking at when did it start? Where do you feel it in your body? How does it feel? What beliefs and behaviors are there around it? And when I gave that example of stopping biting my nails and just stopping, sit yourself down and really look and say, well, I've been grappling and wrestling with this issue, and I've done therapy and doing retreats, and I'm really, really working with it. And see if you can't find in yourself a place where the heart just breaks open and you just say, okay, I don't have to be a seeker anymore. I don't have to heal anymore. I'm healed. I'm a finder. I'm done. And then just do it and then see what happens. So keep working with all of that. Bring me your questions. Keep looking at everything I've talked about, and bring me your questions and your engagement around all this, what you're seeing in clinic, and particularly what you see from these contemplations in the homework. Again, I went way over. I think we did a 2.5, 2 hour, 45-minute video. So I've been told that I'm a very generous teacher. And as far as I know, I hold nothing back. I mean, I give everything I have, everything. There's no technique, there's no knowledge, I've just give absolutely everything. And I mean, what else really? What else is there to do? That's what we're here for. So thank you all so much. See you soon.